The courtroom is silent, so quiet that even a single breath feels too loud. And as Kody Brown walks past the wooden benches without looking back, you can feel it. This isn't just a legal battle. This is the moment an entire family finally puts its truth on trial. Before the judge even speaks, everyone already knows. Someone is about to break, and nothing after this day will ever be the same. If you've ever wondered what really happened behind closed doors in the sister wives family, stay with me. And before we go any further, drop a comment telling me whose side you think the truth is on. Because by the end of this story, your answer might change. Kody sits at the long table, fingers interlocked so tightly his knuckles have gone pale. His eyes fixed forward, but unfocused, as if he's staring through the wall rather than at it. The courtroom smells faintly of old wood and recycled air, and the overhead lights cast a cold glow that makes every expression sharper, harsher, impossible to hide. Behind him, the past 30 years of his life feel stacked like invisible evidence. 4 wives, countless children, promises spoken with certainty and broken quietly over time. Christine sits 2 rows back, her posture straight, but her jaw tight, lips pressed together as if holding in words she's waited years to say. She isn't crying, not today. Today, she looks resolved, like someone who has already grieved and come out the other side stronger. Janelle sits beside her, calm on the surface, but her foot taps against the floor in a steady rhythm that betrays her nerves. Meri sits alone, a small space between her and everyone else, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes lowered, her face carrying the weight of someone who has learned what it means to be forgotten while still being present. And then there's Robyn. She dabs at her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders slightly hunched, the picture of vulnerability. But if you look closely, there's calculation there too. A constant awareness of how she's being seen, how every movement might be interpreted. She glances toward Kody, waiting, always waiting, for reassurance that doesn't come. The judge enters, and the room rises as one. When everyone sits again, the sound of bodies shifting echoes like a warning. This isn't about paperwork or technicalities. This is about accountability. Years of televised smiles and staged family meetings have led to this exact moment where the performance ends and only truth remains. The case begins not with accusations, but with silence. The kind that dares someone to speak first. Kody's lawyer stands and clears his throat, launching into words about family structure, shared agreements, and mutual consent. But the phrases sound hollow, floating uselessly in the air. Because everyone here knows the real questions aren't written on any document. The real questions live in the memories. The nights spent alone, the favoritism no one wanted to name, the slow erosion of trust disguised as patience. Christine's lawyer stands next, her voice firm but controlled, and as she speaks, Christine finally lifts her chin. The story she tells isn't dramatic at first. It's methodical. Years of emotional neglect, unequal treatment, decisions made without consultation, love promised but rationed. And as the words stack up, you can feel the room shifting, leaning in, listening harder. And this is the moment where you realize this case isn't about divorce. It's about who rewrote the rules without telling anyone else. Christine is called to the stand. As she walks forward, every step feels heavy but deliberate. She places her hand on the Bible, swears to tell the truth, and sits. Her voice trembles at first, but then steadies. She talks about entering the family young, believing in plural marriage with her whole heart. She talks about sacrificing independence for unity, jealousy for faith, identity for belonging. And then she talks about watching that belief crumble slowly, painfully, as attention shifted and loyalty became conditional. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't insult. She simply tells the truth, and somehow that hurts more. Kody shifts in his seat. He shakes his head once, almost imperceptibly, as if rejecting her version of events. But he doesn't interrupt. He can't. Not here. Janelle is next. Her testimony is quieter, but no less devastating. She speaks about finances, about decisions made behind closed doors, about being treated like a partner only when it was convenient. She explains how practicality kept her loyal longer than love ever could. The courtroom listens as if afraid to miss a single word. Meri isn't called yet, and that absence speaks volumes. Robyn's lawyer objects frequently, questioning phrasing, tone, implication. But the judge overrules again and again, reminding everyone that this court exists to hear uncomfortable truths. Robyn presses the tissue to her face, tears slipping through, but her eyes flick constantly toward the jury, searching for sympathy. If you think you already know who the victim is here, pay close attention, because the story is just beginning to turn. When the court breaks for recess, the room exhales. Kody stands abruptly, pacing near the back wall, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He mutters to his lawyer, his voice low but sharp. Christine sits perfectly still, staring straight ahead, as if movement might crack the composure she's fought so hard to maintain. This is only session 1, and already the foundation is shaking. Because when the judge announces that next session will include private family communications entered into evidence, messages never meant to be seen, Kody finally looks afraid. And for the first time, the question isn't whether the family will survive this court case. It's whether the truth will survive being spoken out loud. Stay right here, because the next testimony doesn't just challenge Kody's narrative. It threatens to expose the one person everyone assumed was untouchable. Before we continue into the next session, I want to hear from you. Whose testimony do you think will change everything when this courtroom reconvenes? The courtroom feels different when everyone returns, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves absorbed the tension from the first session and decided to give nothing back, and Kody knows it the second he sits down, because today isn't about general grievances or emotional neglect anymore. Today is about receipts, memories frozen in text messages, and moments no one thought would ever leave the privacy of their phones. And as the judge calls the court to order, there's a subtle shift in Robyn's posture, her shoulders stiffening, her chin lifting just slightly, like someone bracing for impact, but still hoping the wave might pass over her instead of crashing directly into her chest. And when Christine's lawyer stands again, there's no warmth in her tone this time, only calm precision, the kind that signals something sharp is about to be placed on the table, because she begins talking about timelines, about dates that don't quite line up, about moments when Kody claimed he was unavailable, but evidence suggests otherwise. And Kody's jaw tightens as the first set of printed messages is handed to the clerk, the sound of paper sliding across wood, echoing louder than it should. And suddenly, this isn't a family dispute. It's a reconstruction of reality, frame by frame, word by word. And Christine listens without looking at Kody, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond him, as if she's already moved on emotionally, but still needs this truth acknowledged publicly. And when the lawyer reads the first message aloud, a casual text from Kody about needing space on a night Christine remembers begging him to stay, there's an audible murmur in the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge. But the damage is done, because the words hang there, undeniable, and Kody's lawyer objects on relevance, but the judge overrules, stating, That emotional context matters in cases involving long-term relational agreements, and that single sentence feels like a crack in Kody's armor, because for years he's controlled the narrative by simplifying it, and now the court is officially saying complexity matters. And this is where the story quietly shifts from opinion to proof, from feelings to facts, and nothing feels safe anymore. And also be sure to include capital letters from contracts and competency. Also be sure to include capital letters from contracts and competency. Also be sure to include capital letters from contracts and competency. Also be sure to include capital letters from contracts and competency. Sign permit from then to now. Also be sure to include capital letters from contracts and competency. Bree, 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 Bree. Christine is called back to the stand, not to repeat herself, but to respond, and her voice is steadier now, less raw, more resolved, as she explains how moments like this weren't isolated, how they formed a pattern, how she slowly learned that asking for equal treatment branded her as difficult, and how silence became her survival strategy until it nearly erased her. And as she speaks, the camera of the mind zooms in on Kody, whose foot is now bouncing uncontrollably under the table, a tell he doesn't realize he has. And then Janelle's name is called, and the air shifts again, because Janelle doesn't bring emotion first, she brings structure. She talks about calendars, about financial records, about family meetings where decisions were supposedly collective, but outcomes were already determined, and she mentions Robyn without naming her directly, referring instead to a consistent prioritization of one household, and Robyn's breath catches audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as if surprised, but the surprise feels practiced, and the jury notices, because perception is everything in a room like this. If you're still trying to decide who's telling the whole truth, remember that numbers rarely lie, but people often do. The judge allows the introduction of shared financial documents, and Janelle explains how resources were redistributed, how sacrifices were framed as temporary but became permanent, how independence was praised until it became inconvenient, and through it all, Kody stares straight ahead, his face a mask that's beginning to crack at the edges, and when cross-examination begins, his lawyer tries to paint Janelle as resentful, as someone who misunderstood the structure she agreed to. But Janelle doesn't flinch. She calmly responds that understanding a structure doesn't mean accepting abuse within it. And that line lands hard because it reframes everything, and the judge nods slightly, just enough to signal that the court is listening closely. Then comes the moment no one expected this early. Robyn is called, not to testify fully, but to address inconsistencies. And she stands slowly, her movements careful, deliberate, as if every step has been rehearsed. And when she sits, she immediately begins to cry, apologizing for being emotional, apologizing for the situation, apologizing without actually apologizing for anything specific. And her lawyer guides her gently, asking about her intentions, her efforts to support family unity, her belief that she never wanted to be favored. And Robyn nods through tears, insisting she only ever followed Kody's lead, that she never asked for more, that she was misunderstood. And for a brief moment, sympathy flickers in the room, because vulnerability is powerful. But then Christine's lawyer stands, and her first question is simple, almost gentle, asking Robyn if she recognizes a specific message, time-stamped during a family emergency. And Robyn freezes, just for half a second. But half a second is enough. And when the message is read aloud, thanking Kody for choosing us tonight, the room goes silent, because that sentence reframes everything Robyn just said, and Robyn's tears stop abruptly, replaced by rapid blinking, and she claims she doesn't remember the context. But memory loss feels less believable when the words are right there. Strong, this is the moment viewers lean forward, because intentions don't matter as much as impact, and the impact is finally visible. Kody suddenly stands, interrupting, his voice raised, insisting that messages can be misinterpreted, that context is being twisted, and the judge immediately orders him to sit, warning him sharply about courtroom conduct. And that public correction hits Kody harder than any accusation so far, because it strips him of authority in the one place he's used to controlling everything. And as Robyn steps down, her face pale, Meri's name is finally called, and the tension spikes, because Meri has been quiet, almost invisible, and everyone knows that people who stay quiet the longest often carry the heaviest truths. And as she walks to the stand, there's no drama in her movement, no tears, just a tired steadiness. And when she speaks, her voice is soft, but unwavering. And she talks about loneliness, about being legally bound, yet emotionally abandoned. About watching dynamics change and being told it was her fault for not adapting fast enough. And she admits to clinging to hope longer than she should have. Not because she was weak, but because she believed promises meant something. And her testimony doesn't accuse loudly, it accuses quietly, which somehow feels more devastating, because there's no anger left, only clarity. Strong, if you've ever mistaken silence for peace, this testimony hits differently, because silence can be a scream no one wants to hear. As the session nears its end, the judge announces that next time, Kody himself will take the stand. And that declaration sends a ripple through the room, because everything so far has been about him, but never from him. And Kody swallows hard, nodding once, as if accepting a challenge he can't avoid. And as everyone begins to stand, Christine finally turns and looks at him, not with anger, not with sadness, but with something far more unsettling, finality. And that look lingers. Period sentences break pause, because finality seems to be both in process and decisions lead directly to the trial. Because it says she no longer needs him to understand. She only needs the truth to be heard. And as the courtroom empties, the unanswered question hangs thick in the air. Because when Kody speaks next, will he finally take responsibility? Or will he reveal a version of events that changes everything all over again? The third session opens with a tension so thick, it feels like it presses against the chest, making every breath deliberate. Because today, Kody Brown finally takes the stand, and the moment his name is called, a quiet ripple moves through the courtroom. Not loud enough to break decorum, but powerful enough to signal that this is what everyone has been waiting for. And as he walks forward, his shoulders squared, chin lifted in a familiar posture of confidence, there's a sense that he believes he can still control the narrative if he just explains himself well enough, if he just talks long enough. And when he's sworn in and seated, he starts speaking before the question is even fully finished, eager, defensive, framing himself as misunderstood, as a man crushed under impossible expectations, explaining that plural marriage is complex, that leadership means making hard choices, that not everyone will feel satisfied all the time. And at first, his voice is steady, persuasive even, because he's had years of practice justifying his decisions, years of family meetings where he spoke and others listened. But a courtroom is different, because here, listening doesn't mean agreeing. And when Christine's lawyer begins her questioning, she doesn't attack him directly. She invites him to explain, to expand, to keep talking, and Kody gladly does, describing himself as someone who tried his best to balance love and responsibility. Insisting favoritism is a false narrative created by resentment, and for a moment, it almost sounds reasonable, almost convincing, until the lawyer asks him a simple question about choice, about whether leadership ever gave him the right to emotionally abandon one wife for another. And Kody hesitates, just long enough for doubt to creep in. And that hesitation becomes the crack everyone was waiting for. This is the point where confidence quietly turns into exposure, because explanations stop protecting you once the questions get specific. A lawyer begins reading Kody's own words back to him, messages, statements from family meetings, even recorded confessions from the show itself. And with every quote, the distance between his self-image and the evidence grows wider. And Kody's tone shifts, becoming sharper, more agitated, as he argues context, insists on editing his own past in real time, and the judge reminds him to answer the questions directly, not rewrite history. And that reminder lands like a public stripping of power, because, for the first time, Kody is being told that his version of events isn't automatically the final one. Christine watches without expression, her stillness louder than any reaction, while Janelle leans back slightly, arms crossed, as if bracing herself for disappointment she's already accepted, and Meri stares straight ahead, her face revealing nothing, which somehow feels heavier than tears. When the lawyer asks Kody whether he ever considered how his actions affected Meri specifically, his answer is vague, almost dismissive, talking about distance, about mistakes on both sides. And Meri finally exhales sharply, a small sound that echoes louder than expected in the quiet room. And when she's allowed to speak briefly, she doesn't accuse him. She simply asks, in a calm, almost gentle voice, why accountability was always something she had to beg for. And that question hangs in the air, unanswered, because Kody doesn't have a prepared response for sincerity, only for defense. Strong, if you're feeling uncomfortable right now, that's because accountability rarely looks dramatic. It looks quiet, and it hurts more. Robyn's reaction becomes the next focal point, because as Kody continues, he references protecting his most functional household, and Robyn stiffens, her eyes darting nervously, because even without names, implication is loud, and Christine's lawyer seizes the moment, asking Kody to define what he means by functional. And he responds without thinking, listing compliance, peace, lack of conflict, and the words settle badly, because suddenly love sounds conditional, transactional, and the courtroom feels colder, as if the air itself has withdrawn warmth. And when the lawyer asks whether conflict ever came from wives expressing unmet needs, Kody snaps that leadership can't cater to constant dissatisfaction, and the judge interrupts again, reminding him that dismissing emotional needs isn't a defense, and that second interruption hits harder than the first, because it confirms a pattern, and patterns are dangerous in court. It becomes harder than the first, because it confirms a pattern, and patterns are dangerous in court. As the questioning continues, the emotional cost of years of imbalance is laid bare, not through shouting, but through accumulation, and Kody's frustration grows, his hands gesturing more aggressively, his voice rising despite warnings, until finally, the lawyer asks the question no one can dodge, whether he believes he failed as a husband to more than one wife. And for a moment, the room is completely still, because this is the line between self-reflection and denial. And Kody laughs once, short and sharp, saying failure is subjective, that people choose their reactions. And that line lands like a slap, because it reframes pain as personal weakness rather than shared responsibility. Strong, This is where the audience starts asking a different question. Not who was wrong, but who was willing to learn. The judge calls for a brief recess, and the break feels necessary because emotions are nearing a breaking point. And during that pause, Christine finally closes her eyes, inhaling deeply, as if grounding herself, while Janelle stares at the floor, disappointment etched into every line of her face, and Meri's hands tremble slightly in her lap, the only outward sign that this still hurts more than she wants to admit. And Robyn whispers urgently to her lawyer, her composure slipping, because Kody's testimony hasn't protected her the way she hoped it would. When court resumes, Kody's lawyer attempts damage control, redirecting him toward intentions, sacrifices, and pressures, trying to humanize him again. And Kody leans into that, speaking about stress, public scrutiny, financial burdens, and for a moment, sympathy tries to re-enter the room. But then the judge asks a single clarifying question, wondering aloud whether leadership under pressure excuses harm. And the simplicity of that question dismantles the entire redirection, because there's no complex answer that justifies years of emotional fallout. As the session draws toward its end, the judge announces that next time, expert testimony will be introduced regarding emotional neglect and coercive family dynamics. And that announcement lands like a warning shot, because now this case is no longer just about personal stories. It's about patterns recognized by professionals, and Kody's face tightens, his confidence visibly shaken for the first time. Because expertise is harder to argue with than memory. And as everyone stands to leave, Robyn finally breaks, quietly sobbing into her hands. Not performative this time, but raw, because the protection she relied on is crumbling, and Christine walks past her without a word, not out of cruelty, but closure. And that silent walk-by says more than any argument ever could. If you think the truth has already been exposed, don't look away yet, because the next session doesn't just analyze the damage. It explains how it happened and who benefited from it most. The fourth session begins with a quieter kind of tension, the kind that settles into the bones rather than exploding on contact. Because today isn't about accusations or defenses. It's about explanation, and that somehow feels more dangerous. As the judge announces the introduction of expert testimony on emotional neglect, coercive control, and long-term relational imbalance. And the words themselves sound clinical, almost detached. But everyone in the room knows they're about to hear their private lives translated into patterns and terminology that strip away excuses. And as the first expert takes the stand, a licensed family psychologist with decades of experience studying high-control family systems, the courtroom seems to lean forward collectively, because this witness isn't here to pick sides, only to interpret behavior. And interpretation has a way of revealing truths people spend years avoiding. And she begins calmly, explaining how power dynamics form in families where one voice consistently outweighs others, how emotional resources like attention, validation, and time become currency, and how favoritism, even when unintentional, creates competition rather than unity. And as she speaks, Christine's eyes glisten, not with shock, but with recognition, while Janelle nods slowly, each word landing like confirmation of something she's felt but never named. And Kody sits rigid, his arms crossed tightly, because this testimony doesn't argue with him, it defines him, and definitions are harder to fight than opinions. This is where personal pain turns into a pattern, and patterns are impossible to ignore once you see them clearly. The psychologist explains how individuals in leadership roles can begin to equate obedience with harmony, and how dissent gets reframed as disloyalty. and when she describes the emotional impact on partners who feel replaced rather than chosen, Meri's composure finally cracks, her eyes filling as she stares down at the table, because hearing her life summarized in neutral language somehow hurts more than confrontation ever did. And when Robyn shifts uncomfortably, glancing between Kody and the witness, there's a dawning realization on her face that this testimony doesn't just implicate him. It implicates the system that benefited her most. The next expert, a financial counselor specializing in family resource distribution, takes the stand and explains how unequal financial control reinforces emotional dependency, how decision-making without transparency erodes trust, and how sacrifice becomes exploitation when it's expected from some, but optional for others. And Janelle's earlier testimony suddenly feels magnified, reframed not as bitterness, but as warning. And when the counselor states plainly that fairness isn't about equal outcomes, but equal consideration, the words echo in the silence, because consideration is exactly what's been missing for years. Kody's lawyer cross-examines aggressively, attempting to paint these analyses as generalizations, as theories that don't apply to unique family structures. But the experts remain steady, reiterating that human emotional responses don't change just because the structure is unconventional. And that argument lands heavily, because it dismantles the long-held excuse that complexity justifies harm. And the judge listens intently, occasionally jotting notes, signaling that this testimony matters more than theatrics ever could. If you've ever been told your pain was just the price of commitment, this is the moment that belief starts to unravel. When Christine is briefly recalled to respond, she doesn't dramatize. She simply explains how hearing professionals describe her life makes her feel seen for the first time, how it validates choices she was once shamed for, and her voice trembles not from weakness but relief. And when she says she no longer questions whether leaving was selfish, the courtroom feels that shift deeply, because clarity is contagious, and Janelle follows, speaking about how logic kept her in place long after love faded, how responsibility became a chain rather than a value, and how understanding the system now helps her forgive herself. And those words resonate far beyond the bench, because self-forgiveness is often the hardest verdict to reach. Meri is asked one final question about hope, about why she stayed when evidence suggested she was no longer wanted, and she answers quietly that sometimes hope isn't optimism, it's fear of starting over. And that line settles like dust over the room, because it's painfully human. And Robyn finally speaks again, requesting permission to address the court. And when granted, she doesn't cry at first. She speaks carefully, acknowledging that she benefited from Kody's choices, insisting she never intended to cause harm. But as she continues, her voice breaks, because intention doesn't erase outcome. And for the first time, she admits that being protected came at a cost she didn't want to acknowledge. And that admission is small but significant, because it's the first crack in the narrative that she was merely passive. Period. This is the moment where sympathy and accountability collide, and only one can move the story forward. Kody is offered a chance to respond to the expert testimony, and when he stands, he looks different, less combative, more cornered, and he attempts to argue that leadership is misunderstood, that he was overwhelmed, that love isn't something that can be evenly distributed. But his words lack their former confidence, because the framework around him has changed. And he senses it. And when the judge asks whether he believes now that harm occurred, regardless of intent, Kody hesitates longer than ever before. And that hesitation becomes the loudest sound in the room, because silence at this point, feels like an answer. As the session closes, the judge announces that the final session will focus on resolution, accountability, and forward-looking decisions. And that statement lands with a mix of relief and dread. Because endings require honesty, and honesty has been in short supply. And as people begin to stand, Christine and Janelle exchange a glance that says they've already reclaimed something important. While Meri wipes her eyes, steadier now, and Robyn remains seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty witness stand, realizing that protection without balance is just another form of isolation. Don't look away now, because the final session doesn't ask who was right or wrong. It asks what justice looks like when love has already left the room. The final session arrives with an eerie calm, the kind that only comes after chaos has burned itself out. And as everyone takes their seats one last time, there's a shared understanding that nothing left to be said will undo the past, only define what happens next. And the judge opens by reminding the court that this is not about punishment, but responsibility. Not about rewriting history, but acknowledging it honestly. And those words land differently now, heavier, because after everything revealed, responsibility feels unavoidable. And Kody sits straighter than before, not confident, not defiant, but wary. Like someone standing at the edge of a truth he can no longer step around. While Christine's posture is relaxed for the first time since this began, as if a weight has finally shifted off her shoulders, and Janelle exhales slowly, grounding herself. And Meri looks tired but present, fully present, and Robyn's face is pale, her eyes red, not from performance, but from the quiet realization that survival sometimes means letting go of the story you told yourself. A judge invites closing statements, and Christine's lawyer goes first, speaking not with anger, but clarity, summarizing how love without accountability became control, how equality turned into hierarchy, and how emotional neglect, even when unintentional, leaves lasting damage. And Christine listens with her eyes closed, nodding slightly, because she doesn't need validation anymore. She already found it within herself. And when Janelle's perspective is woven in, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and respect, it becomes clear that this case was never about winning. It was about being heard, and that's a powerful shift, because being heard changes people. If you're still expecting a dramatic explosion, understand this. Real endings rarely shout, they settle. Kody's lawyer stands next, attempting one final reframing, talking about pressure, about complexity, about mistakes made without malice. And while the argument is polished, it feels hollow now, because the courtroom has already moved past justification and into reckoning. And when Kody himself is invited to speak, the silence is so complete it feels almost sacred. And he stands slowly, his voice lower than it's ever been, admitting not guilt in the legal sense, but failure in the human one, acknowledging that leadership became self-protection, that fear of conflict turned into avoidance, and that avoidance caused harm. And while his words don't erase years of pain, they finally align with reality, and that alignment matters more than apology alone. Meri is asked if she wishes to speak, and she does, quietly stating that closure doesn't require compensation, only acknowledgement, and that she no longer seeks explanation for why she wasn't chosen, because she has chosen herself. And that line ripples through the room, because it reframes loss as agency. And Janelle follows, emphasizing boundaries, independence, and the importance of no longer sacrificing peace for stability. And Christine speaks last among them, her voice steady as she thanks the court not for judgment, but for space. Space to tell a story that was once minimized, and space to walk away without shame. This is the moment viewers realize the real verdict isn't delivered by the judge. It's delivered by the people, who finally stop waiting for permission to leave. Robyn is given a chance to speak, and she hesitates, then admits that protection felt like love until she saw what it cost others. That being chosen exclusively didn't make her safe, it made her isolated. And that admission doesn't absolve her, but it humanizes her. And sometimes that's enough to allow a story to end without bitterness consuming it. And the judge listens carefully before delivering the final words, stating that emotional accountability has been established, that financial and relational disentanglement will proceed fairly, and that while no ruling can restore trust, this court recognizes harm and affirms the right of every individual to step into a future without coercion. And that sentence feels like release, because it names freedom without dramatizing it. As the gavel falls, no one cheers, no one cries loudly, because this ending isn't about triumph. It's about truth settling into place. And as people stand, Christine smiles faintly, not at Kody, not at Robyn, but at the idea of mornings without dread. And Janelle gathers her things with purpose, already thinking forward. And Meri pauses at the doorway, taking one last look at a chapter she's closing with intention rather than regret. And Kody remains seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty room, finally understanding that authority without empathy leads only to solitude. If you've stayed this long, ask yourself this: when truth finally shows up, do you cling to the past, or do you let it set you free? And before you leave, I want to hear from you in the comments. Which moment in this story changed how you saw the entire family, and why?